Let's take a look at the agenda then for this chapter. At the beginning, we see here in the very first line, right? He says, it was long believed that the various northern Iroquoian tribes came into existence when a single people moved apart and became culturally and linguistically differentiated. So if I can, this is this idea, right? How does a people come into being? A people comes into being essentially when they separate from other people, and then they start to develop distinct, homogeneous patterns, social patterns, cultural patterns, and the like. And so the idea here is that we have a group of people who are collected together who, broadly speaking, share the same language and the like, and we'll see what that process looks like in just a moment. And the idea is that over time, from this group of people, they separate out, and as a function of that separation, they end up acquiring those elements which we today would think of as sort of forming a distinct society, a distinct nation, right? Not in the political sense, but in the cultural sense. You'll see here that this notion of people becoming culturally and linguistically differentiated, the question is what allows that to take place? And you'll see, and this is the relevance for our class, that the archaeological evidence suggests that the birth of this particular nation, the Huron nation, happens, as he says, following a shift to horticultural production away from the hunting and gathering patterns that had been indigenous to the area. So, now that we've read our salads, now that we've read our Polanyi, this seemingly neutral phrase should say a lot to us. We know that hunter-gatherers produce little to no surplus. They don't live in an environment of exchange. The principle to which they subscribe is the principle of mobility and flexibility, right? The ability to be able to follow your food around. Once you move to horticulture, meaning now you're growing your own food, at that point, your whole system changes. Now you're staying in place, so it changes the very sort of geography of your life. But as we've just seen, it also allows for the possibility of surplus production. It changes the internal dynamics of the society. So right at the beginning, we have this extremely interesting suggestion, which is it's not just a function of some kind of geographically enforced separation, but also, in order for this particular distinct homogeneous culture to emerge, it also is coincident with this shift from one pattern of existence, from the hunter-gatherer primitive mode, into a more, what we would call, quote-unquote, advanced mode, namely a mode of existence secured by horticultural production. So all this to say that the birth of the Huron can be located or anchored in this shift. But take note of that. That will prove to be of interest as we go forward. So what Trigger is going to do for us in this chapter is walk us through this story. How do we go from a bunch of people living in a single place, sort of distinct, or they're all scattered around, to then seeing this particular group of people emerge as a sort of identifiable nation? If we could turn to page 107. So the first point is, the first part of the Trigger discussion locates who these people were prior to agriculture, during the long period in which they were hunters and gatherers. And the main point here to emphasize is that the environment of this sort of part of the northeastern United States and southern Canada, the boreal region around the Great Lakes, is incapable of supporting very large population densities. Simply the nature of the terrain is such that it's hard for many people to keep themselves alive in this environment. You can see that the numbers are really quite extraordinary. As he says, the boreal forest that was established in southern Ontario seems to have had no greater carrying capacity than modern ones, and away from now submerged lake shores probably supported only about one person for every 200 to 300 square miles. So that is to say that the population capacity of this territory was extremely low indeed. If you're in an environment of very low population density, of course, the amount of contact that happens between people is itself then correspondingly low, because you need a very large area just to keep one or two people alive. As a result, he says, the extremely low population density cut interaction between bands, which were themselves made up of perhaps 30 to 50 people, to a minimum. Because of this, individuals tended to marry cross-cousins within their own band, creating bilateral, not matrilineal nor patrilineal structures. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit, if for no other reason to help us with the vocabulary that we're looking at. So we have very small numbers of people living in this large region. Because the populations that could be supported are very low, we have extremely low population density, which means that it is very difficult to organize any kind of systematic exchange or interaction between the people who are living there. They just don't meet very often. That means you don't need a lot of formal rules about, for example, whose territory belongs to whom or all that kind of stuff. It's essentially negotiated naturally as a function of the conditions that are there. And one of the key elements that comes out of this, or one of the key problems of this, is when you have small groups of people of only 30 to 50 members, you have problems of endogamy and consanguinity, right? If you do not have enough genetic variation in your population, pretty soon the population will expire as a result of excessive inbreeding. So this requires that there's at least a minimum number of people who have to be part of your band, and 30 really is pushing it. Even in a society of, in a society of 30, you might be able to get away with it. Much lower than that, you're going to end up with endemic problems of inbreeding. And of course, the net result of inbreeding is infertility, and so therefore your population falls apart, your population collapses. One of the ways that this problem is resolved, particularly based on the evidence that we have in, for example, African, Western Asian, and European settlements, is that small groups of people periodically come together in order for the purpose of partner exchange, to create reproductive pairings across the boundaries of the band. So you come together and you essentially exchange husbands and wives in the two bands, which provides for genetic diversity. But when you're in an environment like this, it's extremely challenging because you have very low population densities. That's not a reliable strategy. So instead what you have are actually very elaborate rules for determining who can marry whom. And although these people lived outside of any kind of paradigm of genetic or even basic scientific understanding, perhaps presumably through practice, figured out that as long as you weren't too closely related, you could get away with in a reproductive pair. And so presumably the size of the bands are being defined then by that kind of limit, the genetic limit that's created on how many people you need in order to reproduce successfully. It should also be noted, although not mentioned here, that presumably population growth in this kind of an environment would have been extremely low indeed. So these bands, not only would they have been small, but the populations themselves would have remained stable over a long period of time. This is the period that we would call the archaic period of the North American indigenous experience, which is around, into North American prehistory. So perhaps 5,000 years before BCE, 4,000 years, 3,000 years BC. This is the time period that we're looking at. Okay, if we can turn to page 109, please. One of the things that we find in this period is that as time goes on, there is some evidence of slight population increase over time. So we're talking maybe over the period of several thousand years. There is a slight population increase. But that population increase is itself limited again by those kinds of exogenous environmental factors. And one of the major problems facing the indigenous populations of this area was that the food availability was itself rather random. And I draw your attention to what he says here. It may be inferred that in the late Archaic period, the population of Southern Ontario was divided into hunting bands, each composed of several hundred members. So at this point, already we're seeing groupings that are larger than we saw, say, several thousand years previously, but they're still relatively small. And the other element is, actually, there's two. One is, it may be inferred. One of the interesting things about this chapter, there's no direct evidence at all about anything about what he's saying. So everything that we're talking about here is based on what we might be able to infer from the archaeological record, which is itself very scanty. So it's a remarkable effort at reconstruction absent any kind of strong evidence. Nonetheless, those inferences seem to be legit. He says, the area lacked herd animals. The members of these bands therefore had to break up each autumn into small groups that scattered in search of game in different parts of the band territory. One of the things that we're going to see, there's two strategies. Either you go to where the food is or the food comes to you. And if you are smart enough or lucky enough to be able to locate in an environment where animals herd together, then at that point you don't have to displace, right? You simply wait for the migration, and then you cull some part of the passing herd. So it's a great way to get your food. I think I may have mentioned last time the example of West Coast indigenous populations, which place their settlements at points where salmon come in from the ocean to spawn. And they were able to secure an entire year's worth of food simply by stringing nets across the river where the salmon swam up. They would capture the salmon, dry the food, and so on. So even though they were not farmers, they were still quote-unquote hunter-gatherers, they could stay in one place because the migration pattern of animals was such that they were able to secure their food from one particular area. In this case, given the nature of the environment, it requires essentially a random strategy of hunting. You go out to hunt a specific deer or a moose, and believe it or not, actually in earlier times they would hunt elephant because there were elephants roaming around in North America, although not anymore. Nonetheless, by the time we're at this, already over this period, because of slightly increasing populations, we see a couple of things develop that should have some echoes, some resonances for us, even though we're still early in the class. Notice here what he says, at the bottom, again, this is inference. He says, in summer, the various segments of the band, so imagine you have a group of people, they all speak the same language, they're all sort of scattered around, they come together occasionally for the purposes of hunting. But now we start to see rituals develop, moments in which they are coming together as a group. He says, in the summer, where was I? In summer, the various segments of the band, the Indian tribe, would gather under the leadership of a recognized headman. Supported by abundant catches of fish, the members of these bands found time to enjoy each other's company, to arrange marriages, and to celebrate rituals, one of the most important of which was the burial of their dead. Let's pause for a moment, because for those of you who've been following closely, you'll recognize in that idea exactly what Polanyi is talking to us about. People coming together with surplus for the purposes of what Polanyi calls redistribution, right? You bring your catch together into a single place, and then it gets distributed out. And as we saw in our reading from Polanyi, a typical way of redistribution is through things like communal feasting. So you have big dinners for everybody, and all the food that's being collected is shared amongst the society. That helps reinforce the social bonds, particularly where those social bonds themselves are somewhat fragmentary because they're only happening in certain parts of the year. The other interesting note in this is you'll see another thing that we've observed, which is once you have principles of redistribution, you also have principles of inequality, or at least you have the need for some kind of hierarchical authority, right? Some kind of manager, if you will, for those of you who are in the BBA. And here we indeed see that. There seems to be the emergence of what are called headmen, right? People who have the authority to collect from other people. This is simply the necessary consequence of a surplus that requires coordination for the purposes of then redistribution. No suggestion, by the way, that the headman operated as some kind of political chief or as a point of contact that could be then used to facilitate these forms of this form of social redistribution. Trigger further argues that the evidence that we have for these groupings, these moments of interaction, suggests that they may have had what he calls a political function. He said these larger groupings function as political units, by which he means that perhaps they help to define the territory that belonged to them. This is the territory in which we hunt, right? That kind of thing. So that's a kind of political idea. Claiming land for yourself and then enforcing those claims. He also says they were necessary to regulate the economic exploitation of these areas, he says at the bottom, and to provide long-term support for their constituent family groupings. Again, economic in the sense of creating institutions to help secure the food that you need to keep the populations vibrant and ongoing. Note then the change that's happened over this period of time. We've gone from this initial early archaic period of small groups of people living endogenously in groups of 30 to 50 in a world which is very sparsely populated, to an environment, say, several thousand years later, in which the population density has expanded quite considerably. As he says, population densities may have approached 1 person per 25 square miles. So compare that with the previous population densities of 1 person per 300 square miles. One of the ways that you can increase population density is you can exploit resources more effectively, as we saw in the Vaclav-Smil reading. But of course, another way that you can increase population density is you can be more efficient about the production and consumption of what is available. And presumably, in this case, both of those factors apply. Coming together and sharing resources will inevitably, or should, lead to higher population densities simply by virtue of the fact that it creates more efficient distribution of available of available resources, sharing the surplus, and so on. He says in this context, the isolation of the communities would have been much smaller than they had been previously, breaking down the individualism of these different groups and multiplying and fissioning the bands, and says under these conditions, band endogamy declined in favor of intermarriage between different groups. So once you're at this point where you have people coming together on a somewhat regular basis, at that point you can solve the endogamy problem by now arranging for partner exchange across the boundary of the band. That, of course, creates generally genetically healthier populations, and of course further helps to cement relationships between the different groups.